this organization has absolutely zero credibility. We should have nothing to do with it. The world should shun this ridiculous so-called court. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Steve Hilton Show. In a moment, we're going to get to the ridiculous state of affairs that's going on in New York with this Trump trial. It just feels to me that it's getting more and more ludicrous, and more evidently ludicrous. And the political impact is more counterproductive for the people who thought this would derail Donald Trump's presidential campaign. We'll get to that in a minute. But there's something that's just happened as we tape this show that I just cannot believe. The International Criminal Court, a bunch of international, look, they say they're lawyers. It just feels so partisan and political. They've issued arrest warrants for war crimes for Hamas and the leadership of Israel. This is just sick. I hate to just echo Benjamin Netanyahu's talking points. I don't agree with him on everything. I'm certainly wouldn't put myself as a supporter of him in particular. Definitely a strong supporter of the state of Israel, as you know. But he put it very clearly, and it's really hard to argue. This was the first thought that came into my head. My version of what I'm about to say was, imagine if there was a similar process going on with a similar bunch of people in the Second World War, and they issued a war crimes arrest warrant for Hitler, quite right, but at the same time issued one for Churchill or FDR for fighting against Hitler. That's the equivalent. Netanyahu made that exact point, and he brought it more up to date. He said this is like issuing an arrest warrant after 9/11 for bin Laden, but at the same time issuing one for George W. Bush. And of course, people can say, the invasion of Iraq was not justified and so on. I get it. But we're just talking about the first part of it, right? Pursuing bin Laden for his crimes and his gang of murderous terrorist thugs. And you put the same equivalence with that and the US government that's responding to an attack. It's laughable. Well, that's what they've done here. That is exactly the equivalent. Because it's true, of course, that in pursuit of accountability in the case of bin Laden, there were things done that caused people to die and so on. It's war. It's not pleasant. It's bad. It's to be avoided at all costs. But if you are attacked, you have to respond. Otherwise, all civilized society collapses. You have to have the establishment of civilized norms. You have to draw lines. You cannot just stand by and do nothing when you're attacked. Otherwise, it's just going to turn into a complete free-for-all. And that was true after 9/11, and it was absolutely true after the vicious, brutal, savage attack on Israel by Hamas on October the 7th, which, let's remember, proportionately was a bigger attack on Israel than 9/11 was on America. And this ridiculous bunch of international bureaucrats and so-called judges, I don't know what to call them. They're activists. And they are pro-Hamas activists, because if you're trying to draw an equivalence between Israel and Hamas, like the exact same, putting on the exact same level, that's what they've done here. There's no difference between them. That clearly is siding with Hamas, given the facts of this case. And as I've pointed out before, the idea that Israel is deliberately pursuing, they call it genocide, and they've got all these list of things that they're doing deliberately. It's just laughable. As I've said, New York Times columnist David Brooks did a very, very deeply reported column on all this a few weeks ago, and he's no fan of Netanyahu and so on, but he talked to expert after expert in our military. They all say the same thing, that Israel, in its pursuit of Hamas, which is totally justified, given what Hamas did to Israel, is taking far more care to avoid civilian casualties and deaths than America and our allies did in either the Afghanistan or the Iraq war. Of course, it's true that people are dying and they're suffering, but who's causing that? Who is it? They talk about the starvation of children. Who's causing that? It's not Israel. It's Hamas. They're the ones stealing the aid that's going in. And who's putting the lives of innocent civilians in Gaza at risk? It's not Israel. It's Hamas who's hiding behind them and using them as human shields. I mean, it just is preposterous. This absolutely preposterous. This idea that you can put Israel on the same moral plane as a bunch of murderous savages in Hamas, and you dare to do this after the release of that incredibly important and searing documentary by Sheryl Sandberg documenting the pure evil of Hamas in how they used sexual violence as a weapon of war, rape and mutilation with a level of barbarism that is just almost impossible to imagine. Right, that took place, and now you have these so-called human rights champions like George Clooney's wife, Amal Clooney, putting the murderous, barbarous savages who mutilated the genitals of women for fun as a weapon of war, rape and slaughter, who killed children in front of their parents, parents in front of their children, and you're putting them on the same level as the leadership of the nation that was attacked and is responding. I mean, it's just sick, absolutely sick. Thank goodness Biden, for once, has condemned it. He called it outrageous. I mean, that's a mild word. But at least he's done that. I mean, this organization has absolutely zero credibility. We should have nothing to do with it. The world should shun this ridiculous so-called court. They shouldn't even be allowed to use the word court. There is absolutely no justice involved in this decision that they've made. It is pure partisan point scoring, trying to put Israel on the same level as Hamas. It is absolutely disgusting, and it should be condemned by the entire civilized world. All right, so the Trump trial just goes from bad to worse in terms of the credibility of the people who brought this. I mean, what on earth are they doing? They still haven't laid out what the crime is. I mean, it's just unbelievable. We still don't know. And they've rested their case now as I'm taping this. It's the end, and we still don't know what the crime is. We know that there's a misdemeanor that they're trying to pursue him over, which is the falsification of business records, but the statute of limitations has passed on that, and so they can't charge him with that, and they want to make it a felony because they want it to be more serious. So they have to have the falsification of the records was done in pursuit of another crime, but they haven't told you what the crime is. And one of the candidates for the crime is the idea that this was all done as in order to influence the election. That's their main thing. They're saying this was all about influencing the election, and it should have been declared as an election expense. Instead, it was listed as a legal expense or whatever. But then this is the most outrageous part. I still don't understand how this even happened. There is a guy called Brad Smith, who's from previously on the Federal Election Commission, who was there ready to testify about the particular aspect that's at the heart of this, which is what is the crime? What is the crime that turns this into a felony that you should be prosecuted for? And one of the candidates is this idea of the it was a breaking election law because it should have been declared. Here's a guy who says no, that's not correct, because even if they take the original payment to Stormy Daniels, made on whenever it was in October before the 2016 election, end of October, when the payment was made, not even the falsification, just even if you take that original payment just before the election in 2016, this guy who was on the regulator, the Federal Election Commission, says that it was only required to be reported on December the 8th, after the election. So the idea that this was somehow interfering with it and breaking the rules in order to interfere is just not even true on the law. So guess what? That guy was all ready to testify, and the judge said no. He was there as an expert witness to make this point. And actually, that single point literally destroys the case that they're trying to make, that this was some kind of election fraud. So the jury can't be told about that. So the jury's probably sitting there thinking, yeah, well, they did try and interfere with the election, but and the guy who could have corrected them, you can't hear from him. So I'm afraid as each day goes by, it just confirms everything that Trump's been saying. You saw with the Stormy Daniels testimony the other week, which all the legal experts concluded was completely irrelevant to the case. It was just tawdry, salacious details in order to damage Trump in the eyes of the public outside the court, frankly. Proves that it was political. And then here we are again. When Trump's saying all the time that the judge is biased and that the whole system is rigged, what more proof of that do you want than this decision? Not to allow the jury to hear the legal facts that would have completely destroyed the prosecution's case in relation to the alleged election fraud. The judge said, no, you can't hear that. So, I mean, what more do you want to prove what Trump's been saying? Every time he goes in and out of the court, he said, this is a biased judge, it's a rigged. They're just proving it on a daily basis. I mean, the whole thing is a joke. But the biggest joke of all, of course, is that while all this is going on, it's just completely backfiring in a political sense, because all the while that this is going on, Trump's political position seems to get stronger and Biden's position seems to get weaker. The polls increasingly show Trump ahead, not just ahead in all the swing states, but ahead by a lot, way outside the margin of error in most of them. You see this incredible transformation in support. The highest numbers supporting, this was reported in a poll just recently, the highest numbers of black voters supporting Trump since any time before civil rights was passed in the 1960s. Latino votes, we've talked about that before. Latino voters, massive, shift towards Trump. So every way you look at it, this is helping Trump and hurting Biden. And so, I mean, who knows? Maybe he should have been. He's grateful for this ridiculous trial. But the terrible thing about it, of course, is that as it goes on, it just becomes clearer and clearer to people that this really is a terrifying corruption of our system of justice. And putting aside the short term effect on the Trump campaign or the Biden campaign, it's a disaster if people in this country can't have faith in the rule of law and our institutions. That's the real price. That's the real cost of this clearly politicized abuse and corruption of our judicial system by these partisan Democrats. They are destroying faith in our entire system of law and order and the courts and the judicial system. And it is an absolute disaster for our institutions, perpetrated by the very people that endlessly lecture us about the rule of law and norms and democracy and all the rest of it. It is so disgusting to see what they're doing. Joining us now for California Corner, our friend Susan Shelley. Susan, you've got a bunch of water stories that actually are somewhat under the radar. We're going to talk about the budget in a minute. A lot of focus on the budget. We're going to dive into a couple of the more kind of egregious examples of what they're doing with their, as I called it today, their fiscal banditry. But let's talk about water, because I haven't focused on these, and so it's always great you bring us new information and tell us what's going on that we may have missed. So what are the water stories?
Well, the main water story is that they want your money. They want your money to build giant boondoggle projects like the Delta Tunnel that for decades it's been rejected as too expensive and impractical. They want to build the Delta Tunnel, they want to build giant water recycling plants. They want to have giant boondoggles which are all like the bullet train. They just create jobs for people who donate, jobs and contracts for people who donate to the people who are in power. The big excuse to do this was the drought, which they went on and on about, telling us it was permanent. It was the new hotter, drier climate condition. It was California's future. We had to adapt to it. And the only way to adapt to it is to raise everybody's taxes and water rates. Well, this was in August of 2022. And by January, there was so much rain. By January of 2023, there was so much rain, they were spilling it out into the ocean by the acre foot. It was very disturbing to watch. Now we're stuck with all of these things they did during the drought, and they're trying to get everyone to agree to find a way to raise water rates. So there are three bills in the legislature that would allow water agencies to raise rates more easily and make it more difficult for taxpayers to challenge illegal water rates because they have to be based on the cost of service. They can't just raise your rates because they've decided they don't like certain types of water use, and so they're going to discourage. Water rates have to be rational based on the cost of service. That's the law in California. So AB 1827 would allow them to use what they think will be the demand of certain types of parcels to raise their rates. AB 2257 cuts down the amount of time that California ratepayers have to challenge illegal water rates, which would allow essentially a hide the ball strategy where they don't have to show you the rate studies. So by the time they show you the rate studies, the time has elapsed and it's too late to challenge them. That's got to stop. And then SB 1072 says no refunds if you're overcharged, only credits on your future bill, which doesn't help anyone who's moved. So that's not right. So those three bills are rocketing through the legislature with all the water agencies just about in California backing them and the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association opposing them. So give your lawmakers a call and tell them no to these bills that attack Prop 218 from it's the right to vote on taxes, and it also includes rights for challenging fees like this and rates. It's Prop 218 from 1996. Tell your lawmakers to respect Prop 218 and stop attacking it. The other thing with water that's going on is you might remember that in 2018, Governor Jerry Brown, on his way out the door, signed two bills to give us permanent conservation. Make conservation a way of life in California, I think he called it. And everybody was going to be limited by right around now to 55 gallons of water indoor use per day. Now, it was never really clear how this would be enforced, but apparently it's enforced by fining the water agencies. And the time has arrived to write the regulations. Well, the regulators, after two wet winters where we're seeing video of water spilling out of the reservoirs because of flood control issues, people are not going to stand for it. And the regulators seem to be a little bit skittish. So they have written regulations that push the hard choices to 2035. And the people who wrote the bill are very upset. Former Senator Bob Hertzberg did an op-ed with another lawmaker who co-authored one of these bills, and they're very upset because it's like we have to conserve water, hotter, drier future, and they will not acknowledge that this is just California's climate: wet years, dry years. It aligns very nicely for demagogues with the election calendar.
So so the 55-gallon limit per day, or the rationing, I mean, we should just call it what it is, it's rationing, like, which is ridiculous. Like, wh we could it's so frustrating, all of this, because if we had a rational policy, then we would have abundant water, which we could use for agriculture, we could use it for, our domestic, there's no reason that we should have to be worrying about water, and so why has it become this kind of complicated, contested thing? Why do they have this mindset where it's all just, climate and it's a nightmare and you have to ration water and pay more for it to discourage you from using it? I mean, it just all seems so incoherent.
Well, part of it is the philosophy of some of these hyper environmental activists who are just determined to make life in California unlivable because people are the problem with the earth, and they just believe that. But the more cynical part that hits the government is that they can create the demand for tax increases. They can create the demand for more government control over everybody else. And that's what they want, is they want more money and they want more control. And so climate change is this permanent emergency, whether it rains or it doesn't rain. It's always it's climate change. It's the climate. It's not climate change. And none of these policies affect the climate that we're doing. It just makes living in California more expensive.
More expensive. I mean, and at the same time as there, so does this mean everyone's going to end up with massively increased water bills
Absolutely. That's exactly what it's going to mean.
at the exact
And
same time when they're shoving up the cost of electricity?
yes. Well, the cost of electricity is actually in the cost of water in California because it's pumped around the states with electric pumps.
Yes.
So when the cost of electricity goes up, you also see an increase in your water rates. But there are many different things that we could do in California that would give us an adequate supply of water for everything. But there's resistance to doing it. You probably remember the desalination plant that was planned for Huntington Beach for, I think, decades. And they did all of the environmental work and they did all of the design work and they did it again and again to mitigate this and to mitigate that at the demand of, and then the Coastal Commission killed it. So what are we doing? Well, that was not gonna be a big union project, that was a private project. So what's happening, I think, is, as I said, it's the bullet train times 100 all over the state, giant boondoggle projects at taxpayer or ratepayer expense to mitigate this problem of climate change the way that these government people wanna do it. But in fact, it's just a lot of big jobs and contracts for people who support the people who award the jobs and contracts.
So would these water rates go up for will district by district, or is this is gonna be a statewide effect?
Well, it's a little bit of both. They're creating regulations at the state level that require the water agencies to do things, and then the water agencies have to raise the rates to be able to do it. But the bills that are moving through the legislature would just make it easier for the water agencies to find ways to raise rates based on things that are illegal. They can't do it.
It's all just a one-way street, isn't it? It's just more costs, higher bill. I mean, they've just put in the with the utilities, they're putting in an extra chart. They're putting in the charge, the fixed charge is going up, the gas tax is going up. That's another thing that's coming from from CARB, the Air
Yeah.
Resources Board.
Right. And one of the interesting things, in my opinion, is that this is creating a lot of social friction because we have a lot of immigration coming into California. And without getting into any of the politics or the policy of that, you can't expect people who live in California to be happy about that when they're being told there isn't enough water, there isn't enough electricity, we don't
Yes.
have money to fix the roads, we don't have money for the schools, we don't have this, we don't have that, we must have higher rates, we must have higher taxes. Come on in.
It's
There's
a
something
brilliant
wrong with
point.
this.
It's such a brilliant, obvious point, Susan. That's exactly right. They're saying I mean, it's almost it's like in a way, it's a really genius. I'm gonna say that all the time. I'm gonna shamelessly steal that because that's what they're saying. We don't have enough of anything. We don't have
Right.
enough water, we don't have enough electricity, we don't have enough money, we've got a deficit, and so let's just invite everyone in.
Everyone in and free
Amazing.
healthcare for everybody, full scope Medi-Cal, whatever you
Yeah.
need, come on in. Just as if you were a citizen of the United States who had fallen on hard times and you needed government assistance with medical insurance, you'd be in the safety net. You're in that. You walk over the border, 10 minutes later, you are signed up for exactly the same benefits that a person who is a citizen of the United States can have in California.
And the most egregious one, I mean, I wanna get onto the budget, but, the one that really it's not the biggest one in terms of its impact, but the one that there's something about it that's so offensive, which is the free down payment assistance, the
Yes.
home loan for a home loan for people who are here illegally. And it's just there's something so wrong about that. So we've had this massive housing crisis. People can't afford a home. 50. We just a new number that just came out. The median house price in California, $900,000. So people can't the typical home 900,000. People can't even imagine buying a house on a normal income these days. But if you're an illegal immigrant, you get help with your down payment. I mean, it's and you've got people here who are themselves immigrants who've been here 20 years, 30 years, who still can't afford to buy a house because it's so expensive thanks to the Democrats' policies. And then these people just sort of waltz right by them and get a handout from the government to get to buy a house. I mean, it's so offensive.
It is offensive, and there are veterans who are not getting the assistance that they
Yes,
deserve to get, and
yes.
and we're providing unlimited, from a budget point of view, unlimited healthcare, unlimited assistance to people who can choose to come into the country illegally, and the governor welcomes that. But how do you do the budget when you have unlimited entitlements for an unlimited number of people? You can't. You have no idea what that's going to cost, but you've promised it. And even with the budget deficit that we're having, the governor will not pull back that promise to provide full scope, not just of the emergency care that they're entitled to according to the courts, but full scope Medi-Cal insurance coverage for everyone who comes here illegally. There's no way to know what that's going to cost. But one thing it will do is crowd out the people who are already on the program and who are waiting too long for medical appointments as it is because there are not enough providers who will work for these very low reimbursements.
It's an absolutely brilliant point that needs to be made every single time any of this comes up. It's the Democrats who are telling us. through their rhetoric, but also their policies, that we don't have enough of these things: water, electricity, housing, money. And at the same time, they're saying, "Oh, great, let's put even more demands on our state." It's so incoherent. It's a brilliant, brilliant point. Let's talk about one of those things: not enough money, the budget. I mean, there's a lot. There's the budget was the other week, um, and there's still I think there's one more round of negotiating, and they go back with. So it was the May revise, they call it, that the governor published, and now they go back to the legislature and they argue about it and so on. But I mean, there's a couple of things that really stand out in terms of what they're doing to plug this hole that shouldn't even be there. We're not in a recession. This is this deficit that we have. This sort of that they can't even agree what the actual number is. The Independent Legislative Analyst Office say it's much, much bigger than what the governor's saying. But this, just a couple of years ago, we had a massive surplus, and they've spent that money on election bribes, handing out checks to people to vote for them in the run up to the 2022 elections. And so now we have a deficit. I mean, tell us a little bit about what that, just some of the aspects of this that are causing people to get a little bit fed up.
Well, the governor blames climate change for the budget deficit because, according to the governor, it rained a lot. The IRS gave everybody in California an extension to pay their taxes. So they didn't get the money into the Treasury in April. They got the money into the Treasury October, November. And they didn't know when they did the budget in June how much there would be. So they overspent. Now, they could have done a more reasonable estimate, but they chose to overspend. So now we have a huge deficit. And what are we supposed to do about that? There's no appetite for tax increases. There's no appetite for bonds. We saw that Prop 1 barely
Yes.
passed, and that was supposedly going to be very popular, and people looked at the price tag. At the very minimum, the price tag was right there on the ballot and said $6.38 billion. No. And what are they going to do? The governor says he doesn't want to raise taxes, but it turns out he is raising taxes. He's eliminating some business credits and deductions to the tune of $18 billion over a number of years. And the big problem with that is when you eliminate tax credits that you've put in the law that people have counted on, and they've made investments based on the fact that these tax credits are there for certain types of investments, and then you pull them away. What is the message you're sending to businesses all across the country? It's, if you come to California, you're on your own, because whatever they promise you, they can yank away for no reason other than they've overspent somewhere else. And that's what they're doing. So it's really troubling to see that, because the main problem in California is that we're driving away businesses and jobs and tax revenue by doing this kind of thing. So it's a circle the drain policy when you harm businesses.
And then there's some row he's got going on with the teacher unions.
Yes. Because of the big rainstorm and the late money, they did their Proposition 98 funding formula for the schools, which is in the Constitution. There's several different formulas that they can use depending on circumstances. And they gave the schools what amounts to $8 billion too much. Well, the governor doesn't want to pull that back, and he doesn't want to say that he spent it. So what he's not acknowledging it in the budget. He's calling it non-education spending, and he's creating some sort of a loan for the next 3 or 4 years where money from other departments will be used to make up that $8 billion that he gave the schools. The legislative analyst was not impressed with this. They thought it was rather troubling and not transparent for the future budgets. Um, Very novel, I think they called it. The teachers union is upset because apparently by calling it non-education spending, it messes with the formula for the future years of how much they calculate the schools have to get. So it reduces funding in a way through math. It reduces funding in the future to let them keep the money from the year that they didn't know how much they were going to get, all because of climate change. And so the Democratic interest groups are feeding on each other. It's not going well for them.
And also, it's just not true. I mean, the business thing is a tax increase, isn't it? I mean,
Yep,
that's basically what it is. And he's saying, no, that we're gonna. That was the sort of headline message from the
right,
presentation of the budget, which is we're going to close the budget deficit with no increase in taxes.
right. That's just a lie. Because when you take away tax credits and you take away deductions, you're raising taxes. So that's what he's doing.
I mean, it's just it's so interesting how just the collapse of competence and therefore our confidence in the California's government. I mean, it's such a shame to see it.
There's a lot of math tricks that they're doing where they're
Yeah,
deferring and they're delaying, and so that's gonna come back to bite us in next year's budget. But he'll be gone. At some point, he'll be gone, and he doesn't care. If you push it down the road far enough, he can say it wasn't my fault, and that seems to be the goal here.
exactly.
Keep the interest groups happy and keep the taxpayer groups from rioting with pitchforks and torches because he can't raise taxes on us anymore. He just can't. We're so highly taxed in California, it's unreasonable.
But they're also dipping into the reserves, which are not for this purpose at all.
Right. The reserves are for a budget emergency. The governor has to declare a budget emergency,
Right.
and there is no emergency. So it'll be interesting to see what he writes because you have to justify it. And what's the emergency is that they guessed wrong about how much money was coming in and they spent too much and they want to continue to spend too much. They did make about $17 billion in cuts to revenue that was spending that has not yet gone out the door. They stopped some of the, at least temporarily delayed some of the spending that was authorized in last year's budget. They've stopped that. So they are making some cuts and there's a lot of squealing going on in Sacramento. But it's important to remember that the governor's budget is not the real budget. The governor's budget is just a proposal. And then the legislature passes the real budget, but not on the date that they say they do. They're supposed to pass the budget on June 15th, but they pass a placeholder budget. That's not the real budget either. And then they go and they do the real budget and then trailer bills after it. And we have like a year round process of amending the budget.
Exactly. I mean, the emergency that they're talking about to ju to justify the emergency is Democrat policies. That's the
Exactly.
emergency.
Exactly.
Um, and these ridiculous budget bills. I mean, you were the first to alert us to that. These trailer bills, they pass blank bills and then fill them in later to avoid public scrutiny. I mean, the whole thing is such a fiasco. It's yet another example of what happens. The arrogance of one party rule. They get completely complacent in the budget process. Think I'm right in saying because they have a supermajority, the Republicans are just completely irrelevant and out of it. They have no role in it, even
Right. Well, it used to be the case that the budget had to pass with a two-thirds
two
vote,
thirds.
but that was changed, and it was changed they were always late in passing the budget, and sometimes people would get paid with IOUs, state employees. It was very embarrassing for California. So we had this constitutional amendment that changed the process, made it a simple majority to pass the budget. So we have that. I mean, the Democrats have a supermajority, but even if they didn't, it would only take a simple majority to pass the budget. And it created this deadline date, June 15th. If they don't pass a budget, they don't get paid. So they pass a budget, but it's not the real budget. There's nothing in the law that says it has to be the real budget.
It's
So
so
this is,
unbelievable.
if everything was going well in California, none of this would matter, but things are not going well. And then when you look at the process, you can see how we get there.
Exactly. It is just it's laughable. It's like children in a way, like skating around the rules, but they're the people in charge. I mean, but that's why we have to be here to expose it. And you do such a
Exactly.
brilliant job of that, Susan. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve.
So finally, I mean, what are we going to do with Biden? I mean, it's just so embarrassing. It's just sort of you watch him now. I mean, I made the point, we talked about it here about the drug tests and so on for this debate that we're going to have. But, like, he makes the point every single time he's out. Did you see the latest one? He's doing this speech, and it had to be corrected by the White House 9 times. There were 9 mistakes in the speech. It was just sort of hard to watch. I mean, he's mumbling, can barely read things out. The most famous one that got a lot of the attention was where he said he was vice president during the pandemic, and Barack Obama sent him to Detroit to turn things around in Detroit. And you can say, well, in one sense, it was just, one word that he got wrong. Instead of pandemic, he should have said recession or financial crisis or whatever. But it's much deeper than that. To make that mistake, that's not a slip of the tongue, like mispronouncing someone's name. That's like you're completely muddled in your head. I mean, I think most of us remember where we were during the pandemic and what we were doing. It wasn't that long ago. He was actually the president during it. And so this is just really concerning. And there's a whole bunch of other ones. As I said, 9 that they had to correct. One of them was where he said that they get, I can't even remember what it was now. I think it was in health insurance or something, that he claimed that everyone got $800,000 of benefits from some change that he made. And then he corrected himself uh, to just 8,000. But it turns out that the real number is 800. So it's sort of a massive exaggeration. And he's just sort of completely out of it. How can this be? How can we have a president who is just so obviously, falling apart mentally and physically? It is just so terrible to watch. Um, I mean, I've always been in the camp that says they're not going to switch him out, that it's not going to be, this situation that everyone's been talking about, that at the convention, they they get together and they say, look, we can't go on with Biden. We have to have someone else, and Gavin Newsom gets put in or whatever. I've always said, no, that's not going to happen. Biden is totally vain. He's obsessed with being all his life. He's been obsessed about becoming president. He's not going to give it up lightly. They can't push him out and so on. But you watch him on a daily basis, absolutely out of it. And you just think, well, actually, yes. I mean, surely the Democrats know that they can't have this guy. Uh, I mean, it's just amazing to watch. It's a scandal in a way that they're still trying to foist him on us. We'll see what happens. Um, but I don't know. My hunch is they'll stick with him, and that is the biggest insult to all of us as American citizens. The biggest insult of all. All right, that is our show for today. Hope you enjoyed the Steve Hilton Show. Make sure you follow us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure you check out Big Ideas Book Club, and we'll see you back here soon for the next episode of this show.